There are certainly times that I
big celebration winning the cup last night.
He's got that look. Which Will Ferrell character is this?
Oh
Russ?
my God, it is. It does look like a Will Ferrell character. He looks like he's about to yell, "Ma!
Yeah.
The meatloaf! The meatloaf!"
Fuck! There it is. I got the word in.
I feel like I'm on crazy pills. I'm on crazy pills. Yes.
All right, this is why I wear the hat, everybody.
Yeah,
there you go.
That makes sense.
Yes,
Again,
there's a full head of hair.
Again, this is an exclusive for why you should always tune in when we do a live episode on Facebook and YouTube. I don't even know. By the way, really quick, since we started with around 100 people across all platforms, I want to just tout this as we always do. YouTube channel, youtube.com/@snowthegoalie. I think we're at over 950 subscribers. We're trying to get to 1,000 here before the summer really kicks off. So if you're watching right now and you've found your way to this show, please go over and subscribe. You can hit the little bell. Ring the bell. Ring the bell. There we go. It's filling. Ring the bell. Hey, G81 Ross just subscribed right as I said that. So go over to YouTube, youtube.com/@snowthegoalie. If you're watching on Facebook, that's fine. We still love you and care about you. If you're watching on Twitter, we love you and care about you. But please go over to YouTube. And there's a couple of exciting things that we're going to have going on over on that YouTube channel this summer. I talked to Anthony about this yesterday. We have a back catalog of, this is episode 206. And the goal at some point, whenever I get the time, is going to put the old back catalog. Some of those might even be video episodes that we've never released the video for. So we're going to be adding those to the YouTube channel as well. And I think I might even try to pull some of the old Press Row show, even though it's not really relevant. You can go back and you can listen to us, arguing about a game against the Islanders 3 years ago. Just for like the people who are sick and decide that they want to go back and listen to those Press Row shows.
You know what good ones would be there? The No Pucks Given would be pretty good.
No Pucks Given, we could put that back up. Maybe I think we should bring that back in the fall, by the way, because that was just a lot of fun. So anyway, I guess we'll get started here, but thank you to everybody. We're 125 people right now across all platforms. That's not so bad. Let's get started, gents. Oh, yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome into Snow the Goalie, the Only Flyers podcast, the People's Podcast, the Players Podcast, the Prognosticators Podcast, the Pedialyte Podcast, the Pampers Podcast, the Presidential Podcast. But oh dear, we had somebody on the show not that long ago who was excited to be on the show and promised us that she would come back onto the show, and now she's leaving in like 2 weeks. That's Val Camillo, who we'll talk about here in a second. Oh, by the way, the Flyers have also made a hire, bringing back former Flyer Patrick Sharp in an advisory role. And oh, that's right. There was a player that we talked about last week as potentially being on the trade block who, the national guys came out this past week and said, well, we're going to say the quiet part out loud about Carter Hart and potential trades. We'll get into all that today. But of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce the gentleman next to me. And I'm going to start with the man in the middle, Anthony Sanfilippo. Find him on Twitter @AntSanPhilly. How are you doing, you beaut?
Oh, it's been a week, Russ. It's been a week already, and it's not even the whole week. It's only Wednesday, right? But it's been a week so far. But I'm doing good. Excited to be back on the episode, and then there's new Flyer stuff to talk about and give you some background, some behind the curtain stuff, and looking forward to it.
And of course, the man on the other side, and that's Bundy, Chris Tarian, on Twitter @CTarian6. I know you're great, but how are you?
Doing awesome. Doing really good, guys. It's been, the finals end. There's a lot of really good stuff going on around the Flyers in every facet. Patrick Sharp, you said, coming on. I played with Sharpie, loved him as a teammate. One of the really great human beings that you're going to find too outside the game of hockey. So that's something, the more quality people you have like that are around the organization, you get back to what once was here. And that's been the goal. I think it's been a goal of mine since I started, guys, on this show, and over 200 episodes, something that you guys started. But it's great to be back, guys. I have a lot of good stuff. I was actually talking to Jonesy yesterday for a few minutes before the game. He was having a coffee with the great one. And I called and he said, I'm just having coffee with 99 right now. And I said, another guy I used to dominate in the D zone. He said Gretzky was having a good laugh. So you know what? It's good stuff, and you know what? That's something I think that you have to know about the people in there. There's a lot of good light hearts with Jonesy, but a serious guy as well, and somebody that's I think is really gonna plug in the right chords into the outlets here and get this thing fired up and rolling again. So it's going to be a great summer draft coming. I'm looking forward to the show today. It's going to be a quick one. I know because me and Anthony got kids on the go, Russ. You know, and as little Dino gets older, you'll understand when you start dragging him around from one place to another. If you're not already.
Started to get a taste of that with soccer
Yes.
and dance here with two of the kids. So it's only a matter of time before I'm pulled in every direction. Guys, before we get into the meat of the conversation here on the Flyers, the Vegas Golden Knights blew out the Florida Panthers last night, won their first Stanley Cup. They also took down a record that had been in place for more than 30 years. And that, of course, is the record of the fastest or the fewest amount of years for an expansion team to go on and win a Stanley Cup. The Flyers had previously held that at 7 seasons. The Golden Knights have now done it in 6. So now they take that spot in the record book. So all those people who complain about expansion and how unfair it is and all that, don't forget the Flyers once upon a time, and it was different. It was a different league. The Flyers were an expansion team who went on to win a Stanley Cup. Nolan Patrick, former Flyer, gets a ring as part of this. So kudos to him.
His name won't be on the cup.
It won't be, but
No.
he was there. He was part of it. How did you guys
Where
feel?
was he part of it? I didn't even remember he was even there.
He was on the roster. He got
Was he?
paid this year. How do you guys feel about Vegas as the champ? Ant, I know you had said a while back that you thought it was a lot of smoke and mirrors with Vegas, but you thought they would end up winning in pretty decisive fashion. Did the series kind of go the way you expected it to?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be honest. I mean, things broke well for them. I thought that their best series. I thought was against Dallas. I really thought that was. I thought that was the team that can knock them off. Look, Colorado was banged up and beat up. So I mean, look, Colorado's the favorite already for next year, right? I mean, they're the money line favorite to win the cup next year, and that's because they played with so many, without so many players or with guys that were hurt. So Vegas didn't have to worry about Colorado. The rest of the Western Conference was not, in my mind, as good as the teams in the East. Dallas was the one team I thought could beat them, and they played really well in that series, and kudos to them for that. And then of course they get the 8th seeded team out of the East, in the Stanley Cup final. They didn't have to play, a Boston or a Carolina, or even a Toronto or Tampa or the Rangers, like all those teams that would probably have given them a much harder series than Florida did. And that's not a knock on the Panthers. It's just that they were on such a great run, and then all of the sudden they get a 10-day break, and that kills you. And you go back and look at, there's somebody did this thing on YouTube, and I could find the link. I'll put it in the comments for everybody. But somebody did this thing where they looked at teams with rest in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and they don't do well.
Look at it, 97. Listen, I don't think we were beating Detroit, Anthony.
Right.
But we were off for 9 days in 3 series. We had almost 25 days of rest between 3 series in that 97. We won 4-1, 4-1, 4-1. And then we went to the finals, and Detroit had that war with the Avalanche.
Yep.
And we were sitting around watching that. And of course, as Detroit goes into that finals against us in 97, they're more than battle ready for the finals. And we're sitting there going, we never understood the time what the implications and ramifications were of that brawl and the Lemieux hit on Draper and what that did to Detroit. They were a better team, better talent, but the 9 days, those breaks did not help in going into the finals. It was it dragged out. It did hurt guys for sure.
And I think it hurt. I think it hurt Florida.
Oh, no doubt about it. No doubt. And how
Kachuk getting hurt and not being able to, I mean, he tried to play through it. Like, kudos to him. Like a real pros pro. But can you really quick walk people through this? So when you hear, hey, you're going to get a week's rest or a little bit over a week rest, the thing that people talk about, players talk about throughout the postseason is no one's healthy. And so like there is a bit of value in getting at least a couple of days rest, try to get your body back in order, but probably not that full week. What does that do in terms of changing your approach to being in rhythm? Like, are we talking about daily practices? Are we talking about, like, is it strength and conditioning? Like, does it mentally remove you from the situation? Like, what does that look like from the player's perspective?
Yeah, you do feel like you're disengaged entirely for like 5 or 6 days of it, because you're going to have the 2 days where you're kind of chilling out after. You understand there's going to be a lull and there's going to be a break, so you get 2 or 3 days where you're just not really doing much. You have light practice, probably 2 days off, and then you come back in. You have practice, try to stay sharp. Then you'll do some scrimmaging to try to get some game simulation. You'll probably do that a couple times. You're not going to do a whole lot in the weight room in the finals. When you really look at the finals, and people might tell you differently, you're playing on emotion and you're playing on a lot of just sheer will by that time. Like, you're in the finals, the excitement carries you. But you're not getting the best of guys athletically in the finals. You're not getting their best hockey that they have. You're getting the teams that have grinded it out through 3 rounds to make it to the final round. And sometimes it can be sloppy. It can be sloppy some nights in finals, but it's a way of just trying to figure it out and finding your way to winning enough games and to get there. Florida did. I mean, you have to have, that was a case for Florida, Anthony. Vegas was a much better team, and Hill was able to respond and play better with underneath, in front of that type of lineup. Where Florida, it felt like their defense kind of like fell apart a little bit in the finals, but also at the same time, they just didn't have the horses, and they needed Bob more than Vegas needed Aiden Hill to be that guy. Bob had to steal a game, and he didn't in the finals to give them a chance, and that was, to me, the difference.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly. And, the last thing I wanted to say about this is that when you look at the way Vegas's roster is constructed, once again, and, I know that this is a Russ Joy thing.
Here we go.
And I'm not discrediting it, because I do, it is a way you, obviously, if you have superstar players right at the top of your roster, and they can carry you and take you to a championship. Of course, if you get a bunch of them, right, that's the whole goal of quote unquote tanking. But look at that Vegas team, right? And look at how deep their lines are. And they're not guys that are super uber talented players. Yeah. They're pluggers. They're grinders. They're guys that are just tough to play against. That's what won them the cup. And it's the same concept that St. Louis used when they won the Stanley Cup, right? Same kind of group that they had. Yes, Washington had Ovechkin, but I kind of felt like the year that they finally broke through, that the bottom of their lineup was like that, right? I think that that's something that should really be, that it sometimes gets overlooked because everybody's chasing the superstar, chase the superstar. And well, you look at teams like Toronto who have a bunch of superstars and they can't win, and Edmonton who has superstars and they can't win. Well, why not? What's not there for them? And we've been saying goaltending, right? They haven't had goaltending, but okay, Vegas just won with Aiden Hill. And that's not a knock on Aiden Hill, but it's Aiden Hill, for God's sake, okay? And so you need good defense. You got to be able to be willing to put your body on the line and block shots. I know the analytics community hates block shots, but damn it, Vegas was the best shot blocking team in hockey, and they did it all through the playoffs and frustrated teams nonstop with that because they were willing to put their bodies on the line, and they had good depth as far as players who were willing to grind it out and did not need to be your star players. And you got a guy like Jonathan Marchessault who ends up winning the Conn Smythe. He's no superstar. I mean, he's a good player, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he's not a superstar. And yet, yes, they have they got Eichel and whatever, and yes, they went over the salary cap by $14 million, but with using LTIR, right? So there's things that Vegas did that you could sit there and go, they're a little bit closer to, what a top end team would look like in the grand scheme. But ultimately, the reasons that they were able to win this Stanley Cup had much more to do with further down their lineup than it did with who was at the top of their lineup.
I agree.
All right, so we have a bunch of people weighing in. One of them is a friend of the show, Trevor Harris, who actually works down in Florida and I believe does radio work around. It's for the station that has the rights to the team. So he checks in. Fun fact: Paul Maurice in his second cup lost again in 5 games, just like 2002. Panthers D has been a problem all year. And then said the Panthers also didn't have enough cap space to fill out lines 3 and 4, pretty much a men's league line is what he calls it. And then also says, they're paying Barkov 10 million, Ekblad 10 million, and Kachuk 10 million as well. So in a way, like, could we almost make the argument that because of how top heavy they were, at least in terms of like how the cap was allocated, that they're like the best case scenario of what Toronto's been trying to do and has been unable to succeed at, which is you stack the top of your team with these high paid guys, but then perhaps it does cause problems, as you get farther down the lineup. All right, let's dive into something else here now, guys. We're beyond the point. I think we've given enough time to the Stanley Cup, and now we have to bring it back. Let's bring it back local here. The Flyers are undergoing once again some turnover. The best way to put it is we had Val Camillo on the show and Keith Jones on the show a couple episodes ago. We called it the Presidential Podcast episode. You can go back on YouTube or in wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. Apparently, we're also on Odyssey. We're everywhere. I don't know how or why, but we are. So anyway, Pandora. So you can go back and listen to that episode or watch it. Val Camillo came on the show. She said she was going to come back. She had a lot of fun. She broke Anthony's toe in the dunk tank, allegedly. We thought that she was going to be back. She was part of the collective in front of a large swath of media at Wells Fargo Center. She was up on the stage. She was in a way like master of ceremonies in introducing people and kind of talking about the business vision for the team going forward. And here we are a few weeks later, and Anthony reports first. And then, of course, everybody else can confirm Anthony's report that she's going to be leaving the organization. She's leaving Comcast Spectacor effective July 1st. I wanted to know what your initial reactions were. And I guess I'll start with Anthony, who broke that story. And again, now I am able to confirm Anthony's report. So go ahead, Ant. Your thoughts.
Was I surprised by it? I wasn't surprised by it. So just here, I'll give you the backstory. So when Dan Hilferty was hired, I was told pretty quickly that Val may not want to stay with the setup that they had. Now, this was before we knew Dave Scott was retiring, right? Because remember, Hilferty was brought in. A lot of it had to do with, dealing with the whole Sixers and the arena thing and everything else, right? So it was now going to be a situation where there were 3 CEOs at Comcast Spectacor. And it just is like, is that something that can work? Like, there was a lot of skepticism that 3 CEOs for the same company could kind of operate together. So I had heard back then in March that it was a real possibility that Val would look to go somewhere else. It was poo-pooed when I started asking around about it. Like, because, some people had told me she's going to look, she's going to go. And then, some people that I talked to said, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. She's going to stay. She's going to be a big part of this, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, okay. But it was always in the back of my mind that this is a reality, that this is a possibility. And more so, I think, and I don't think it's speaking out of turn to say that I think Val kind of thought that there was a possibility that if Dave Scott was going to retire or be replaced, that she would have that opportunity to step into that role and be, the person in charge overall. And when they bring in Hilferty and then Dave Scott retires and Hilferty kind of becomes the guy. I mean, yes, Val's, also a CEO in charge of, the sports and entertainment division of Spectacor. I think it still looks for her, it looks like there's still a step that she has to overcome to get to the place that she would ultimately want to go. Right. So I think that when that kind of reorganization kind of took place, even though she was a willing participant amongst the 5, leaders of the organization with Jonesy and Briere and Torts and Hilferty, I feel like that was a time when it was almost like, yeah, maybe there's a better opportunity somewhere else. And When she's looking at it and thinking about it, there's probably a situation where the responsibilities that she would have would kind of be, there would be like a ceiling, right? I mean, you can only go so far with those responsibilities without being able to surpass others. And if you're still kind of, she's still young and she's still, in her career and trying to get further along, and credit to her for that. Maybe you look at it and say there might be better opportunity elsewhere. And so I think that ultimately, when you kind of put all those things together, that was probably why she decided to look somewhere else. We don't know exactly where she's going. I get the sense that she's going to end up back in the DC area. It's not going to be with the Washington Commanders. I know there's been a rumor about that going around, that she's going to go down there as part of the Harris Blitzer entertainment group. But I don't see that happening. We talked to some folks over at that would know, and she's not going to be going with them. I think that, but I do think that there's a possibility that she ends up with Ted Leonsis in some capacity, whether it's with the Wizards or the Capitals or both. And hey, if the Nats get sold, and there's talk about that, and Ted might be involved in that as well. Who knows? Maybe she goes back to the Washington Nationals as well. So there's some, I think there's some things that could potentially happen for her down in DC. And I think that that's a place that she's comfortable and would like to be back at. So ultimately, I think that's what you're looking at here. And when you look at what's happened since the announcement, I mean, they made some other changes, right? And they promoted some people, or gave some other folks in the organization some more responsibility. They basically gave all of Val's responsibilities to other people, so the position's not even going to be filled. It's basically being eliminated. And you heard Dan Hilferty say about unifying everything under one umbrella again. So it's now a more traditional setup, kind of way it always used to be, with Hilferty's the guy in charge, and then there's a bunch of people underneath him, as opposed to 3 CEOs or 2 CEOs. It's now down to there's one CEO, and this is your normal business practice. So ultimately, I think that's what happened, and I'm, like I said, I'm not surprised. I'm going to let Bundy chime in here. The last thing that I want to kind of throw in is that we killed Val on this program for the better part of 2 years, really, when she first came in here, she came in with an idea of doing things differently, of doing it her way, the way that it worked in Washington, and not quite understanding, I think, at the time, that Philadelphia is not Washington, D.C. It's a whole different animal here. I think that she was bullish on doing it her way, and maybe in time learned that might not have been the best approach, and over the course of the last year and a half, changed and started to try and bring things back to the way that they used to be, and with the family, or with the family type atmosphere. But I also am not sure that kind of was the way it was internally. I think that was more just kind of how it was, reconnecting with the fans and doing stuff with Ed Snyder Youth Hockey and things along those lines. I think all that stuff was great, but I'm not certain that it ever created that kind of feeling inside the building as well. So I think that kind of ties into this all, how this all came to be too. So Bundy, I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, it was just pretty good, Ant. You know what?
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of people, I thought this year, so I would try to put it all together. I thought this year the building experience was much better.
Yeah.
The problem is when there's a new regime that comes in, there's a lot of changes that happen, and that happened under Valerie's watch. The other people left, the Peter Luco crew that was still remaining left when she came in. That was Sean Tilger. A lot changed when Ed Snyder passed, right? Like, and I don't have to go back and talk about it. And anyone has visions or talking about the team and say, oh, they haven't won since 75, or I don't care. All right. It was what the mantle was of what Snyder carried for the fans. And that's why I always tell people Flyers hockey and the Philadelphia Flyers are a different view for the rest of the fans in the city. There's some unusual lockstep between the fans when the Flyers are good and for what the history of the Flyers stands for to this community. And it's different than the Phillies. It's different than the Eagles, the Sixers. There's a unique group, a unique culty tie almost to the Flyers. And that's a good thing. You know, that's what I played here with. I saw packed buildings. I saw a city in love with its hockey team. The problem is that it was almost a perfect storm in a lot of ways for Valerie as she came in with a new regime. There was a sliding product on the ice that was slipping. It wasn't good. Changes were happening inside the organization. People were removed. There was the Kate Smith thing that went on that whether you want to talk about it or not, and people can come at us, that affected people in this town, and nobody's going to tell me differently. That was lineage back to the past. And when you start messing with stuff like that, that's why Philadelphia was different. People reacted to that. And I think that hurt. That stuff
This
like
was
that.
This was an unprompted comment that came in 25 minutes ago.
Yeah,
Now that Val's gone, bring back Kate. Like, there are still people, to your point, and it doesn't represent the entirety of the fan base. It certainly doesn't represent the entirety of Twitter. But like, there were people who were upset about the statue. You could say it's stupid. You could say it's totally justified. But like, there were people who were upset about it, and apparently who still remain upset about it.
So again, and my point that I'm trying to make is that there was a tie to the franchise that had a historical significance to people here. The blue collar attitude, the Rocky movie, how people viewed the Flyers. And when you start changing the model of what people were used to, win or lose, because what I'm saying is that we saw people fill the building in other regimes, even when the team was not as good as it should have been, or we knew that it wasn't a Stanley Cup contender, because people would go down for the entertainment value and for what the Flyers stood for to the community, a hardworking team that you're going to identify with. So I think in a lot of ways, there was a lot of stuff that I think Val's regime did wrong at the time that just didn't gel or mesh with it. And as a result, there were nights the building was empty with a bad team. They were doing things that was not eye candy to what people were used to doing here. One thing we've said, guys, is you can't tell a Philadelphia sports fan his business or try to change who they are and what they like and what they view in any sport. We are Philly. And when and then I think the whole view of the corporate change from the family-owned business didn't sit well with a lot of people. And then there was a lot of corporate changes that did happen, a lot of things that you'd see a corporation do that people in Flyers land didn't want to see. Yeah. And I think that's what happened. I will say this. Yes, I was brutal the first year after it. I lost my job over there under that watch. I didn't do it for that reason. I did it because I had a voice with the Flyers. I've been apologized to by the Flyers for what happened. And there's a long story that I will share. As I've told you, I can't right now, but I'm going to get to it. I was apologized to by Valerie and the Flyers for what happened. And I was told it was not them. There was a misconstrued moment that happened at the pandemic. They laid the blame at the feet of someone who I clearly knew would be the person that would do that. And it had nothing to do with the Flyers. Valerie and her team did a great job this year in the building. And we've talked about that, Anthony. She changed things the way people wanted to see them. People came back, and I went down, and I could tell you 2 or 3 years ago, even talking to the bosses, talking to Danny Briere, talking to other people, the hockey people, it was an embarrassment in the building 2 years ago. From a hockey standpoint, from the lack of people showing up, from the lack of passion people had for the Flyers. And I think that opened a lot of eyes. And yes, the goalie was one of the front runners and telling people, having their eyes open to what was going on. But I will say this, the experience this year, even though Val won't be back, she did a 180, and she did a complete 180 from where they were. She listened, changed the dynamic of things. And for that, I'm going to tip my cap to Val. That's, a lot of people go in different ways. Yeah, we've had some animosity together, but you know what? I will give you that, because you deserved it for what happened this year. And it takes a big person to do that. It really does. And I wish Val the best. I know some people can say, what are you talking about? But you know what? I live in a world, guys, where forgiveness and moving forward is prevalent in my world and the life I lead now. And I wish Valerie the best. And if anybody else goes with her and changes jobs too, I wish them the best. But this is a new regime in town. Dan Hilferty understands what Ed Snyder understood and what we've been yelling from the rooftops for the last 3 or 4 years. There's a new sheriff in town. And I think that the Flyers fans are going to like what this is, what it stands for moving into the future. If you love the Philadelphia Flyers of the 70s, 80s, and 90s and the 2000s, then you're going to love this era again moving forward. And that's Dan Hilferty for me and Jonesy, bringing people in with voices, good people like Patrick Sharp. It's all part of it. But I do wish Val good luck, and I thank her for the job that she left us with here this year. It was far different than what we saw coming in. And I will say this, just to finish, Anthony, it's not Valerie's fault that she's not a Philadelphian either. You know, she came in here not knowing it. And when you're hired as a boss to do things and make change, you got to know what you're doing sometimes. Making that change, and it just didn't work out. But the last year certainly will make Dan and Keith's job a lot easier for the fans.
Yeah, I agree. And there's one thing I just want to touch on, and Ron, I'll let you go. And Bundy talked about, hey, if you were a fan of the Flyers 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I know that there is this belief that's out there, and I don't know when this thing started. I mean, look, there's always been a generational gap with sports, right? Forever and ever and ever. The older people say, well, our generation was better, and the younger generation says our generation's better, right? That's always a gal where the older generation completely dismisses the younger generation, and the younger generation completely dismisses the older generation. And the fact of the matter is that when we're looking at consumerism, and we're looking at what this is, because this is a business, that you have to appease both. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that when someone says, if you're under 40, you don't care about that old school stuff. Okay. You may not, but aren't there people 40 to 70 or 75 that are still spending their money on this product as well? Mm-hmm. I'd say they probably spend even a little bit more, to be fair, than the under 40 crowd does. And so therefore you have to, do things for the older crowd just as much as you have to do things for the younger crowd as well. And so I think that once people come to that realization that you can do both, that you can appease the younger audience with a mascot like Gritty, with music in the building that maybe isn't the music that you would listen to, with a more kind of like hip mindset with these behind the scenes videos, right, and everything else. Great. But there's also things that you can do that appeals to the older crowd too, that keeps them interested and engaged and wanting to come back as well. There's nothing wrong with either one. And when you mix the two together, that's when you get what worked for the Flyers for so many years. And I think that that's what this new regime is going for.
And that's what I'm trying to say, Anthony, is that you have everything built in already. It's already here. People want to watch a good hockey game. They want to see it. But there's no need for over-the-top change. And I think I really believe in a lot of ways, yes, like they have Marvel Superheroes Day. Like stuff like that. Kids love that stuff. Mm-hmm. I always tell my friends that have Russ, you'll be a part of that. Heck, you could you could probably join the kids.
That's right. Let me just shave real quick.
You'd be like a young Iron Man there.
That's right.
But stuff like that's really cool. And I always tell parents, like, hey, they got Marvel Superhero Day today at the Flyers game over last year. Go on out. Your kids will love it. And they do. So there is like generational stuff, and you want to bring people in and get them into the building. But to me, the product has to always be about what's on the ice. That's the most important thing anywhere, is what happens on the ice, because everything else on the perimeter means nothing if your team stinks year after year after year. You don't want to be the Buffalo Sabres, guys. Trust me. No offense to guys that played there, but listen, they've been a disaster pretty much since the late 90s. They've been trying one rebuild after another. There's hope. There's not. You want to get it right and move on and forget the hiccup in your history of your team where we had 4 or 5 bad years, 6 years. It's happened. It'll happen again. Hopefully not in the next 20 years. But that's just the cycle of life in pro sports. Your teams are going to go up and down. And I think for the most part, the Flyers fans have been treated to a good winning franchise over the years in terms of getting the playoffs, having deep runs. We'd love to win more Stanley Cups. I would have loved to have won one with the teams we had here. I'm sure Danny Briere would tell you he would have loved to have won in 2010 also. but the spirit of the team can't change. And that's something that they got away from 2 or 3 years ago. That can never be the part that changes. That's the most important thing, is the players and the personnel that drives the machine of hockey, that makes everybody else happy and makes everybody else's job a lot easier. So that's what they got to get back to. And that's what I'm really, really hopeful for.
I don't mean to make it sound like we're living in bizarro world here, but like, I think that there's a fair concern, and there's a fair way to approach the Camillo conversation. A lot of the work that's been done in the past year was damage control, because she came in trailblazing and she kind of fucked things up. And like, there are ways that you can go about trying to change things within an organization or change the way that the team is marketed and all that. But like, when part of Bundy, you even mentioned it, and we've talked about this a million times. She wasn't a Philadelphian, which is fine. You can bring an outside perspective and you can do things the right way. But like, what's the one thing that any high-level executive says whenever they take a new job? They take at least the first 6 months to a year to understand the organizational culture, to assimilate, and then to make change. And for better or worse, it felt like from the moment she came in, she wanted to change without understanding. And one of the things that we've talked about on the show for the last, I would say, 6 months or so, is that, yes, there was a concerted effort to helping make sure that the employees of the team understand the tradition of the team, even going as far as to, have them watch the movie and the video and everything that Anthony has talked about in the past. But like, there is part of the fan base, I'm sure, and it's in the comments here, that believes that, like, you come in, you market yourself as a pioneering woman in a male dominated industry, which is true. She did ingratiate, maybe might not be the right word for it, but she did make inroads with the NHL. She was highly regarded by the NHL as a woman in a prominent role with one of the more important teams in the league. And to that end, like, she did a really nice job. But like, there is the thought that, she kind of did damage control after blowing things to bits on the business side for 2 years. And yes, you can absolutely say that, it was notable and it was worthy. And we touted the fact that they had at least gotten back on the right track. But like, here you go, Philly Originals. She doesn't get brownie points for trying to clean up her own mess. Well, she's not the only person who made whatever the mess is, but like, yeah, you are going back. You do a 180 because you realize some of the initiatives or some of the things that we did as an organization didn't work. What happened with Snyder Hockey, whether that was her, whether that was Dave Scott, whoever it was, the falling out that occurred there and has been talked about, that should never have happened. So the alienating of alumni, Bundy, like, that should not have happened in the way that it did. And so, yes, it is good. And like, we do have to acknowledge when somebody goes out and fixes problems, but there is the need to acknowledge that sometimes those problems that came up were done by those people. So you give them credit for changing course. And at the same time, you can still hold them accountable for the fact that, like, they probably shouldn't have happened in the first place. If anything, maybe it's a benefit that those changes happened. The organization saw how poorly that was received by a large segment of the fan base. And now they know going forward that we cannot go in that direction again. We need to kind of stick to what has always worked, at least from the fan experience side of things. And so here, let's make this another level. Chris Naffy, Val was in favor of Briere as GM, correct? If so, and he turns out to be an excellent GM, is it fair to say her impact on the franchise would be positive? I mean, she's not the only person, and she's not the one who makes that hockey executive decision, but she was high on Briere.
Listen, Danny started sitting in an office for the GM Maine like years before Valerie was even here. Mm-hmm. And that's just a position you sit and watch, observe, and if you hang around long enough and the cards fall the right way, you end up getting a GM job. Like I have a friend in Calgary I went to high school with, Craig Conroy, great guy. But he was assistant GM doing a lot of little things in Calgary for almost 10 years. Stayed around it. Now he's the general manager. So I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think Danny, I think every GM goes into a job with nobody really knowing what kind of a job a GM is going to do, a new GM anyway, until you get your handprint and footprint all over it. And I think that's what Danny's trying to do. He certainly had a good start, but I don't think Val, she might have liked his personality and his demeanor. but no way. I don't think that she was making any calls of whether he can make the decisions in the hockey wise. That, that's where somebody else had to come into it. But he was in there long before Val.
And here are two comments that I think are probably fair. Percendi says, no hard feelings toward Val. I wish her great success, but her departure along with the Sharp hire are reasons for optimism. And then Brian Adams says, nothing against Val either. If the team is an utter dog shit for 3 to 4 years, we probably make little to no mention. And maybe that's ultimately the thing that hurt her initially and her standing with the fans, is that she was trying to make all this change while the team was largely bad. You had the COVID shortened season with the bubble playoffs, where the team outperformed what they should have and kind of gave a false understanding, or at least a false impression to the guy running hockey ops, that the team was closer to being a contender than it actually was. And maybe it's just things didn't break the right way. So we also have comments over here about Kate Smith's statue, which I swear to, I do not want to have that conversation today. Maybe
I don't want to have it ever. I didn't ever want to have it.
Yeah. So, oh, here we go. Scott Deagle checks in and says, when is the Bundy bomb coming? It already happened. It happened 2 minutes into the stream. You can go back and find it. Bundy's first F-bomb of the show was, I think, technically before it even happened. So if you're listening in the podcast feed after the fact, that part got clipped out. So there's been no Bundy F-bomb yet. If you're listening in the podcast feed.
You didn't have that in there. How do you cut that out? That's just a great scene in movie history. And
well, listen, that's why people need to go and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@snowthegollie, where, by the way, gents, as we continue our march to 1,000, we are currently at 970. We're 30 away. We're doing a giveaway when we get to 1,000. So if you're watching right now on YouTube and you haven't subscribed yet, go down below, hit subscribe, ring the bell so that you're notified whenever the live streams happen and new episodes go up.
I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal too. If you're the 1,000th subscriber today,
we don't have a way to verify that.
1,000th subscriber. I can't get the TH out with the subscriber. I'll buy you a slice of pizza. All right, I'll meet you and buy you a slice of pizza. You can have a slice of pizza with me and Anthony. All right, Anthony's going to join us too. Let's sit down and talk Flyers hockey live somewhere around the rink. And come on, who's going to be that 1,000th person?
Oh man, that's great. That's great. Hey, Russ, because I know we have to wrap this up quickly. Let's just dive real quick into the Patrick Sharp hire.
For sure.
So just to kind of give you guys, my understanding on this timeline, this was something that I think was purely driven by Keith Jones. I think this was something that he wanted to kind of, flesh out. Obviously, he needed to get Danny involved with this and Dan Hilferty involved with this and really have like good conversation. Obviously, John Tortorella a little bit too, but I think this was driven by Jonesy, and Patrick Sharp brings a lot of the same elements that Keith Jones does to the organization. Again, as someone who has been around the league, as a national broadcaster who knows a lot of people, who is well liked and well respected, and really kind of gets, has some really great information, not to mention is a really smart hockey guy, right? And here's another thing, they're going to put him, and this is something that's really kind of interesting, because I was told yesterday that his role is going to be very similar to the role Briere had when he was under Chuck Fletcher, with one little tweak where he's going to be very heavily involved with the young players and development as well. Okay. Patrick Sharp was a guy who, as a young player himself, probably got the raw end of the stick. Let's be honest, right? I mean, he was considered a decent prospect here. He was an alternate captain on the Phantoms team that won the Calder Cup. He was expected to come in and be a guy like that was going to, be a decent player for the Flyers. Didn't work with Ken Hitchcock at a time when Hitchcock was trying to win Bundy. This is your team. You were on this team.
I was there when it happened. I couldn't believe
it. Yeah, and look, I mean, Hitch was trying to win in the moment and didn't feel like having a young player developing at the NHL level made sense in his mind. And then Bob Clark goes out and trades him, gets very little in return for Patrick Sharp, and Sharp goes to Chicago, becomes a all-star player, wins 3 Stanley Cups, is one of the leaders of that team along with Patrick Kane and Jonathan Taves, and so he brings that perspective of hey, I was this young player once who maybe didn't get things done the right way to me while I was here. Let me help you understand what the role of a young player is and how you're going to have to progress and what the way things go sometimes. I think that that's a really underrated addition to what he's going to be doing here for the Flyers. I think it will help with development, not necessarily on ice development, although I'm sure that he can still put the skates on and get out there and work with guys if he wants to, like Danny was doing with TK last year. But I think that it could be a real benefit for young players in understanding the process and understanding their role and maybe how they have to switch roles a little bit and play differently at the higher levels than they played in junior or whatever the case might be, and really kind of give them some institutional knowledge that will really be a benefit and help these players develop at a better pace than maybe they have in the past.
It's fair.
Guys, I love Sharpie, guys. I said great person. And yeah, I mean, he got shafted here essentially, you know, and I know Clarkie, they trade him for Jamnov.
No, it was not. He was traded for Matt Ellison and a 3rd round pick. And the 3rd round pick was eventually Ryan White, who played in the league for, you know, a little while, but was never anything special.
Yeah, good guy. Man.
Not a great trade. There was criticism, obviously, that he's a former Flyer, and now they're continuing the former Flyer thing. And it's probably
66 games here. He played 66 games.
It's important to note that he spent most of his career not with the Flyers, won 3 cups elsewhere.
Yeah,
and has more recently served in other roles for organizations not the Flyers. So, I mean, if that's your thing and you like to go back to that, well, by all means you can, but it's probably not fair. Last thing before we head out is this past week, a bunch of the national guys did that thing that they do where they don't cover a certain element of a story and then they come in after the fact and act as though there's a revelation. And that was the Carter Hart being mentioned in trade rumors happened around the time of the Ivan Provorov trade. We had a bunch of people looking for clout saying that it was a done deal or close to a done deal, that Hart was being shipped out. And that obviously did not happen. But the national guys, so we're talking, you know, former local writer Frank Saravalli, and we're talking Elliot Friedman, who apparently it just seems like has become a favorite of a few organizations. We'll put that in a nice way. They both came out in the past week and talked about the fact that Carter Hart probably won't be moved until there's a resolution to the Hockey Canada investigation, which is crazy that they brought it up as like a revelation of sorts, because I distinctly remember us talking about this for 10 months, 6 months. And here we are again, Carter Hart not moved. There continue to be questions about, will he be named in the Hockey Canada investigation, or is this once again a byproduct of teams not wanting to potentially move for a player who has not been officially cleared yet as part of the Hockey Canada investigation? So, Ann, I'll turn to you. Mm-hmm. Where do you stand on it? And, you know, is it surprising that the national guys are now getting in on this topic, months later?
Well, I'm gonna just disagree with you a little bit as far as from the national guys' perspective. I think what they were trying to do, and I can't speak for them, for both of them, but the guys you mentioned. But I think what they were trying to do is say pump the brakes on the trade because this still lingers, right? This Hockey Canada investigation still lingers. I don't think that they were making it out to be like some great big revelation like you do. Like you think that they were, oh my God, why didn't anybody think of this before? Like, I don't think.
I saw a clip where one of the guys said, we're gonna say the quiet part out loud. That to me is making it sound as though this hasn't been something that's been brought to the forefront, which is not true.
It is bringing the quiet part out loud because it's not spoken about a lot. Yes, have we talked about it on this podcast? We have, but there's not been a lot written about it as far as from a perspective of, can you trade a player who was on that team, possibly, and a lot of people are writing about Carter Hart possibly being traded. And what I can tell you is there have been offers that have come in 1,000%. I know this for a fact, but turns out that these offers are if then kind of offers. So here's the deal. If he's not named, then consider our offer. But if he is named and there's suspensions that are handed out or things along those lines, and public sentiment is a lot different, then guess what? Then we're going to pull that offer back. Thank you very much. And we'll maybe discuss it down the road if it makes sense. So I think that that's what those were. And so when people are reporting those, there's conversation about Carter Hart, that's what you're hearing. And that's totally legitimate. It's not like anybody's reporting bad information. But I think what guys like Elliot and Frank were doing in those situations, it's like, okay, just pump the brakes a second, because nobody's really saying what the holdup is here at the moment. The holdup is he's still linked to that investigation in some possibility. Whether he's involved or not, we don't know. But that's going to be something that kind of prevents him or any player in the league that was affiliated with that team from getting moved until we find out exactly what happened or whose name is implicated in that thing. I think that's what they were going with. So that's why I'll give you a little bit behind the scenes there. That's what the offers are like, and why they're not being acted upon. It's not because of the Flyers don't want to act upon it per se. It's more because we'll make this offer, but only if his name doesn't come up in the investigation.
Just trying to figure out it. I don't have a good way to word it. I don't want to say anything. But the thing that I keep coming back to, and look, if ultimately he is cleared, and I mean cleared, and there is no wrongdoing, there's no suspension, I'll come back on the show and I'll recant or whatever. But I pointed this out a long while ago. There were players on that team who came out definitively on their own accord, on their own social media, or through on their own, and said, I did nothing wrong. I was not part of this. I'm not saying that he is going to be implicated in this investigation, but he did not do that. He does have at least one social channel. He chose, or his representatives chose, him to be mentioned as part of a statement by an attorney. And that to me was a red flag at the time, or is at least that's interesting. But that's where I'm going to leave it.
And Bundy can address this because he has had an agent and a representation. Agents a lot of times will make decisions or recommendations for athletes that hey, maybe are definitely in their best interest, or what they think is in their best interest, and maybe sometimes it doesn't quite work out to be in the best interest. Like they're doing it to protect him in a lot of ways. But maybe if it turns out that there is some kind of connection, then it looks like, oh, well, that's why you didn't say something back then. When in essence, that may not be the case. It could be you could be 100% right, Russ. But it could also be that it was just like, hey, we don't want to, we don't want you putting anything out there. Just kind of let it go. Be part of this general statement, and then that's it, and move on, because we think that will be better for you in the long run. That's again just their legal interpretation and advice that Carter's following, right, Bundy? I mean, I think that agents pretty much do that all the time, no matter what you're talking about, and no matter what the sport you're talking about, right?
Probably in the world they live in today too, with a lot of social media and everything flying around. So I mean, again, I understand, I'm just reading some of the stuff and hearing what's going on, but yeah, the agents will always try to protect their asset. And sometimes I think the visuals of those things don't look accordingly to the public. This has been going on for a while, guys, this whole investigation. Yeah. I mean, we've seen so much smoke from it on Twitter from different people. And, I obviously it's a very, very disturbing situation, all of it from top to bottom when you hear about it and read about it. But I hope they can find some finality to this somewhere, so guys can then, be dealt with or be handled with and then move on. I mean, however it is. I mean, but it's been going on a while. It does seem like there's a lot of things that involving of how names are going to come out and people trying to protect sources, methods, what names should come out, what names should not come out. There's probably a whole lot of legal maneuvering, guys, that is far beyond my purview to speak on a sports podcast. But the whole thing is not good for anybody,
Right.
and it's probably causing a lot of issues, not just here, but for other people and other teams as well that are dealing with this.
Yeah, I mean, guys, I'm pretty clear. Like from my perspective, if you weren't in the room where it happened, if you weren't around it, with a very clear conscience, you can say that I was not involved. And deferring to a legal team, to me, just causes a little bit of gray area that you probably don't need to get into, but I will acknowledge this. So Eric Wisniewski over on YouTube says, honestly, sometimes you need to let a lawyer speak for a kid. He's 19 years old to 24 now in the NHL. He's still a kid. And I get that perspective is out there, and that's fine. We'll see where it goes. I do wonder, now that the Stanley Cup is over, and reportedly the investigation has wrapped up, or the NHL is now reviewing it, are we now in a position where they're going to finally announce the findings of the investigation? Is it going to happen now that the cup is over? Is it going to happen before the draft? Will it happen after the draft?
I think teams would like to have it happen before the draft.
Sure.
But I don't necessarily think the NHL is worried about that timeline as much as it's worried about its own PR timeline. So whatever their PR timeline is when it will be released this summer at some point. They may decide it's better to do it in the dog days of like late July and early August when there's not a lot of hockey conversation, as opposed to around the draft, which is an exciting time for young kids, and free agency when guys are getting contracts and things like that. They might wait. But I think that the teams would prefer that it be announced sometime in the next 2 weeks.
Okay. Ultimately, it all comes back to a young woman who was assaulted, and we hope that she gets justice, because that's the most important thing here. We talk about hockey because that is what we do, but that's not the most important thing on the line here. And so hopefully she'll get justice, and this will work out the way that it's supposed to, and we'll get some actual thoughts here. By the way, we've had a few comments like this. My fandom will only be retained by drafting Mishkov. We had somebody right off the bat who said that they'll cry if Mishkov falls to the Flyers at 7. A lot of interesting things coming out around what could happen before the Flyers have the opportunity to pick. We'll get into that over the next few weeks, but that is still certainly something that's out there. Guys, I think that's probably a good place to wrap for today. I don't know if we had any 5 stars this past weekend, Anthony. If we did, we'll have to get to them next time. But I do want to point out something that BJ Beretta said, and I'll throw this out to the people. A Snow the Goalie live event would get a great crowd, and I agree. And we've been talking to some people, we've been talking to some places about potentially doing some live shows. But if you are a business owner out there, or you know a business owner who wants to draw a sizable crowd, Snow the Goalie is a great place to go. A very fanatical following, thousands of people who tune in on YouTube and in the podcast feed. We certainly would draw a large crowd in that Delco region, Montco, Chesco, down around the city, even maybe South Jersey, where there's a fanatical Flyers following as well.
Even maybe.
I'm just saying.
Even maybe.
Even
Bundy.
maybe.
You know what that is?
Who's
That is,
to say?
I live too
Who's
far
to
away from
say?
South Jersey. I don't really want to go there. But if we have to, we will. That's what Russ Joy just, I'm translating
I'm
Russ Joy for
saying-
you right there.
What a fucking dumb comment that was.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. You know what? A big thank you to everybody who tuned in. As always, we had more than 200 people concurrently streaming this on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And I expect thousands more to check in after the fact in the podcast feed and YouTube. Last week's episode, by the way, set an all-time record, I believe, for a non-guest episode of this show. Previously, when we'd been on the Crossing Broad channel exclusively, I think the Konechny interview, maybe the Vigneault one, did a bigger number. But for a live stream and then after the fact with no guests, that was the biggest episode we've done on YouTube. Over 4,300 people tuned into that show. So we'll see how this one does as well. But a big thank you to everybody who tuned in last week, who tuned in this week, who watched live, and who listened after the fact in the podcast feed or watch on the YouTube channel. I just want to give people an update as we head out here. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. And as of right now, we're at 981. So when we go to end this episode, we're at 981. Remember, we get to 1,000. We're going to do a giveaway. Bundy claims we're going to somehow figure out who the 1,000th person is, and Bundy will buy them a slice of pizza. Anthony gets to do it as well, and I don't know why I don't get pizza. We're going to have this
buying
chat
pizza
offline.
for Anthony, too. I'm buying pizza for everybody.
There we go.
Oh, okay.
It was 1,000. Let's go.
And this is great, Kevin Quinn. I still can't believe I'm this invested in the Flyers on June 14th. That's because you've been listening, maybe even watching Snow the Goalie, the only Flyers podcast. Make sure you follow us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pandora, and you can also find us on YouTube, youtube.com/@snowthegoalie. So for Anthony @AntSanPhilly, for Bundy @CTarian6, I'm Russ @Joanne Broad. Thank you so much for listening, maybe even watching Snow the Goalie, the only Flyers podcast. We'll talk to you soon.